That was the last Slone saw of Wildfire for 3 days. It took all of this day to climb out of the canyon. The second was a slow march of 30 miles into a scrub cedar and pinyon forest, through which the great red and yellow walls of the canyon could be seen. That night Slone found a water hole in a rocky pocket and a little grass for Nagger. The third day's travel consisted of 40 miles or more through level pine forest, dry and odorous, but lacking the freshness and beauty of the forest on the north side of the canyon. On this south side, a strange feature was that all the water, when there was any, ran away from the rim. Slone camped this night on a muddy pond in the woods, where Wildfire's tracks showed plainly. On the following day Slone rode out of the forest into a country of scanty cedars, bleached and stunted, and out of this to the edge of a plateau, from which the shimmering desert flung its vast and desolate distances, forbidding and menacing. This was not the desert upland county of Utah, but a naked and bony world of colored rock and sand, a painted desert of heat and wind and flying sand and waterless wastes and barren ranges. But it did not daunt Slone, for far down on the bare, billowing ridges moved a red speck, at a snail's pace, a slowly moving dot of color which was Wildfire. On open ground like this, Nagger, carrying 250 pounds, showed his wonderful quality. He did not mind the heat, nor the sand, nor the glare, nor the distance, nor his burden. He did not tire. He was an engine of tremendous power. Slone gained upon Wildfire, and toward evening of that day he reached to within 1/2 a mile of the stallion, and he chose to keep that far behind. That night he camped where there was dry grass but no water. Next day he followed Wildfire down and down, over the endless swell of rolling red ridges, bare of all but bleached white grass and meager greasewood, always descending in the face of that painted desert of bold and ragged steps. Slone made 50 miles that day, and gained the valley bed, where a slender stream ran thin and spread over a wide sandy bottom. It was salty water, but it was welcome to both man and beast. The following day he crossed, and the tracks of Wildfire were still wet on the sandbars. The stallion was slowing down. Slone saw him limping along not far in advance. There was a 10-mile stretch of level ground, blown hard as rock, from which the sustenance had been bleached, for not a spear of grass grew there. And following that was a tortuous passage through a weird region of clay dunes, blue and violet and heliotrope and lavender, all worn smooth by rain and wind. Wildfire favored the soft ground now. He had deviated from his straight course, and he was partial to washes and dips in the earth where water might have lodged, and he was not now scornful of a screen-scummed water-hole with its white margin of alkali. That night Slone made camp with Wildfire in plain sight. The stallion stopped when his pursuers stopped, and he began to graze on the same stretch with Nagger. How strange this seemed to Slone. Here at this camp was evidence of Indians. Wildfire had swung round to the north in his course. Like any pursued wild animal, he had begun to circle, and he had pointed his nose towards the Utah he had left. Next morning Wildfire was not in sight, but he had left his tracks in the sand. Slone trailed him with Nagger at a trot. Toward the head of the sandy, flat stone Slone came upon old cornfields, and a broken dam where the water had been stored, and well-defining trails leading away to the right. Somewhere over there in the desert lived Indians. At this point Wildfire abandoned the trail he had followed for many days, and cut out more to the north. It took all the morning hours to climb 3 great steps and benches that led up to the summit of a mesa, vast in extent. It turned out to be a sandy waste. The wind rose, and everywhere were moving sheets of sand, and in the distance circular yellow dust devils, rising high like waterspouts, and back down in the sun-scorched valley a sandstorm moved along majestically, burying the desert in its yellow pall. Then 2 more days of sand and another day of slowly rising ground growing from bare to grey and grey to green, and then to the purple of sage and cedar. These 3 grinding days were toiled out with only one waterhole. And Wildfire was lame and in distress, and Nagger was growing gaunt and showing strain, and Slone, haggard and black and worn, plodded miles and miles on foot to save his horse. Slone felt that it would be futile to put the chase to a test of speed. Nagger could never head that stallion. Slone meant to go on and on, always pushing Wildfire, keeping him tired, wearied, and worrying him, till a section of the country was reached where he could drive Wildfire into a kind of natural trap. The pursuit seemed endless. Wildfire kept to open country where he could not be surprised. There came a morning when Slone climbed to a cedared plateau that rose for a whole day's travel, and then split into a labyrinth maze of canyons. There were trees, grass, water. It was a high country, cool and wild, like the uplands he had left. For days he camped on Wildfire's trail, always relentlessly driving him, always watching for the trap he hoped to find. And the red stallion spent much of this time of flight and looking backward. Whenever Slone came in sight of him, he had his head over his shoulder, watching, and on the soft ground of these canyons he had begun to recover from his lameness, but this did not worry Slone. Sooner or later, Wildfire would go into a high-walled wash from which there would be no outlet, or he would wander into a box canyon, or he would climb out on a mesa with no place to descend unless he passed Slone, or he would get cornered on a soft, steep slope where his hooves could sink deep and make him slow. The nature of the desert had changed. Slone had entered a wonderful region, the like of which he had not seen. A high plateau crisscrossed in every direction by narrow canyons with red walls 1,000 feet high, and one of the strange turning canyons opened into a vast valley of monuments. The plateau had weathered and washed away, leaving huge sections of stone walls, all standing isolated, different in size and shape, but all clean-cut, bold with straight lines. They stood up everywhere, monumental, towering, many-colored, lending a singular and beautiful aspect to the great green and grey valley, billowing away to the north, where dim broken battlements mounted to the clouds. The only living thing in Slone's sight was Wildfire. He shone red down on the green slope. Slone's heart swelled. This was the setting for that grand horse, a perfect wild range, but also it seemed the last place where there might be any chance to trap the stallion. Still, that did not alter Slone's purpose, though it lost to him the joy of former hopes. He rode down the slope, out upon the billowing floor of the valley. Wildfire looked back to see his pursuers, and then the solemn stillness broke to a wild, piercing whistle. Day after day, camping where night found him, Slone followed the stallion, never losing sight of him till darkness had fallen. The valley was immense and the monuments miles apart, but they always seemed closer together and near him. The air magnified everything. Slone lost track of time. The strange, solemn, lonely days, and the silent, lonely nights, and the endless pursuit, and the wild, weird valley, these completed the work of years on Slone, and he became unsatisfied, unthinking, almost savage. The toil and privation had worn him down, and he was like iron. His garments hung in tatters, his boots were ripped and soleless. Long since his flour had been used up, and all his supplies except the salt. He lived on the meat of rabbits, but they were scarce, and the time came when there were none. Some days he did not eat, though hunger did not make him suffer. He killed a desert bird now and then, and once a wildcat crossing the valley. Eventually he felt his strength diminishing, and then he took to digging out the pack rats and cooking them. But these too were scarce. At length starvation faced Slone, but he knew he would not starve. Many times he had been within rifle-shot of Wildfire, and the grim, forbidding thought grew upon him that he must kill the stallion. The thought seemed involuntary, but his mind rejected it. Nevertheless, he knew that if he could not catch the stallion, he would kill him. That had been the end of many a desperate rider's pursuit of a coveted horse. While Slone kept on his merciless pursuit, never letting Wildfire rest by day, time went on just as relentlessly. Spring gave way to early summer. The hot sun bleached the grass, water holes failed out in the valley, and water could be found only in the canyons, and the dry winds began to blow the sand. It was a sandy valley, green and gray only at a distance, and out toward the north there were no monuments, and the slow heave of sand lifted towards the dim walls. Wildfire worked away from this open valley, back to the south end where the great monuments loomed, and still farther back where they grew closer, till at length some of them were joined by weathered ridges to the walls of the surrounding plateau. For all that Slone could see, Wildfire was in perfect condition, but Nagar was not the horse he had been. Slone realized that in one way or another the pursuit was narrowing down to the end. He found a water-hole at the head of a wash in a split in the walls, and here he let Nagar rest and graze one whole day, the first day for a long time that he had not kept the red stallion in sight. That day was marked by the good fortune of killing a rabbit, and while eating it his gloomy, fixed mind admitted that he was starving. He dreaded the next sunrise, but he could not hold it back. There behind the dark monuments, standing sentinel-like, the sky lightened and reddened and burst into golden pink, till out of the golden glare the sun rose glorious, and Slone, facing the league-long shadows of the monuments, rode out again into the silent, solemn day on his hopeless quest. For a change, Wildfire had climbed high up a slope of talus, through a narrow pass, rounded over with drifting sand, and Slone gazed down into a huge amphitheatre full of monuments, like all that strange country. A basin 3 miles across lay beneath him. Walls and weathered slants of rock and steep slopes of reddish-yellow sand enclosed this oval depression. The floor was white, and it seemed to move gently or radiate with heat waves. Studying it, Slone made out that the motion was caused by wind and long bleached grass. He had crossed small areas of this grass in different parts of the region. Wildfire's tracks led down into this basin, and presently Slone, by straining his eyes, made out the red spot that was the stallion. "He's looking to quit the country," soliloquized Slone as he surveyed the scene. With keen, slow gaze Slone studied the lay of wall and slope, and when he had circled the huge depression, he made sure that Wildfire could not get out except by the narrow pass through which he had gone in. Slone sat astride Nagar in the mouth of this pass, a wash a few yards wide, walled by broken rough rock on one side and an insurmountable slope on the other. "If this hole was only little now," sighed Slone as he gazed at the sweeping, shimmering oval floor, "I might have a chance, but down there we couldn't get near 'em." There was no water in that dry bowl. Slone reflected on the uselessness of keeping Wildfire down there, because Nagar could not go on without water as long as Wildfire. For the first time Slone hesitated. It seemed merciless to Nagar to drive him down into this hot, windy hole. The wind blew from the west, and it swooped up the slope, hot, with the odor of dry, dead grass. But that hot wind stirred Slone with an idea, and suddenly he was tense, excited, glowing, yet grim and hard. "Wildfire, I'll make you run with your namesake in that high grass," called Slone. The speech was full of bitter failure, of regret, of the hardness of a rider who could not give up the horse to freedom. Slone meant to ride down there and fire the long grass. In that wind there would indeed be Wildfire to race with the red stallion. It would perhaps mean his death. At least it would chase him out of that hole, where to follow him would be useless. "I'd make you hump now to get away if I could get behind you," muttered Slone. He saw that if he could fire the grass on the other side, the wind of flame would drive Wildfire straight toward him. The slopes and walls narrowed up the pass, but high grass grew to within a few rods of where Slone stood, but it seemed impossible to get behind Wildfire. "At night. Then I could get round him," said Slone. Thinking hard and narrowing his gaze to scan the circle of wall and slope. "Why not? No wind at night?" That grass would burn slow till morning, till the wind came up, and it's been west for days." Suddenly Slone began to pound the patient nagger and to cry out to him in wild exultance. "Old horse, we've got him! We've got him! We'll put a rope on him before this time tomorrow." Slone yielded to his strange, wild joy, but it did not last long, soon succeeding to sober, keen thought. He rode down into the bowl a mile, making absolutely certain that Wildfire could not climb out on that side. The far end beyond the monuments was a sheer wall of rock. Then he crossed to the left side. Here the sandy slope was almost too steep for even him to go up, and there was grass that would burn. He returned to the pass assured that Wildfire had at last fallen into a trap the like of Slone had never dreamed of. The great horse was doomed to run into living flame or the whirling noose of a lasso. Then Slone reflected. Nagger had that very morning had his fill of good water, the first really satisfying drink for days. If he was rested that day, on the morrow he would be fit for the grueling work possibly in store for him. Slone unsaddled the horse and turned him loose, and with a snort he made down the gentle slope for the grass. Then Slone carried his saddle to a shady spot afforded by a slab of rock and a dwarf cedar, and there he composed himself to rest and watch and think and wait. Wildfire was plainly in sight no more than 2 miles away. Gradually he was grazing along toward the monuments and the far end of the great basin. Slone believed, because the place was so large, that Wildfire thought there was a way out on the other side, or over the slopes, or through the walls. Never before had the far-sighted stallion made a mistake. Slone suddenly felt the keen, stabbing fear of an outlet somewhere, but it left him quickly. He had studied those slopes and walls. Wildfire could not get out, except by the pass he had entered, unless he could fly. Slone lay in the shade, his head propped on his saddle, and while gazing down into the shimmering hollow he began to plan. He calculated that he must be able to carry Fire swiftly across the far end of the basin, so that he could not be absent long from the mouth of the pass. Fire was always a difficult matter, since he must depend only on flint and steel. He decided to wait till dark, build a fire with dead cedar sticks, and carry a bundle of them with burning ends. He felt assured that the wind caused by riding would keep them burning. After he had lighted the grass, all he had to do was to hurry back to his station and there await developments. The day passed slowly and it was hot. The heat waves rose in dark, wavering lines and veils from the valley. The wind blew almost a gale. Thin, curling sheets of sand blew up over the crests of the slopes, and the sound of it was soft, silken rustling, very low. The sky was a steely blue above and copper close over the distant walls. At afternoon, toward the close, Slone ate the last of the meat. At sunset the wind died away and the air cooled. There was a strip of red along the wall of rock and on the tips of the monuments, and it lingered there for long, a strange bright crown. Nagger was not far away, but Wildfire had disappeared, probably behind one of the monuments. When twilight fell, Slone went down after Nagger, and returning with him put on bridle and saddle. Then he began to search for suitable sticks of wood. Farther back in the pass he found stunted dead cedars, and from these he secured enough for his purpose. He kindled a fire and burnt the ends of the sticks into red embers. Making a bundle of these, he put them under his arm, the dull glowing ends backwards, then mounted his horse. It was just about dark when he faced down into the valley. When he reached level ground he kept to the edge of the slope, and put Nagger to a good trot. The grass and brush were scant here, and the colour of the sand was light, so he had no difficulty in travelling. From time to time his horse went through grass, and its dry, crackling rustle, showing how it would burn, was music to Slone. Gradually the monuments began to loom up, bold and black against the blue sky, with stars seemingly hanging close over them. Slone had calculated that the basin was smaller than it really was in both length and breadth. This worried him. Wildfire might see or hear or scent him, and make a break back to the pass and thus escape. Slone was glad when the huge dark monuments were indistinguishable from the black frowning wall. He had to go slower here because of the darkness, but at last he reached the slow rise of jumbled rock that evidently marked the extent of weathering on that side. Here he turned to the right and rode out into the valley. The floor was level and thickly overgrown with long dead grass and dead greasewood as dry as tinder. It was easy to account for the dryness. Neither snow nor rain had visited that valley for many months. Slone whipped one of the sticks in the wind and soon had the smoldering end red and showering sparks. Then he dropped the stick in the grass with curious intent and a strange feeling of regret. Instantly the grass blazed with a little sputtering roar. Nagger snorted. "Wildfire!" exclaimed Slone. That word was a favorite one with riders, and now Slone used it both to call out his menace to the stallion and to express his feeling for that blaze already running wild. Without looking back, Slone rode across the valley, dropping a glowing stick every quarter of a mile. When he reached the other side, there were a dozen fires behind him, burning slowly, with the white smoke rising lazily. Then he loped Nagger along the side back to the sandy ascent, and on up to the mouth of the pass. There he searched for tracks. Wildfire had not gone out, and Slone experienced relief and exultation. He took up a position in the middle of the narrowest part of the pass, and there, with Nagger ready for anything, he once more composed himself to watch and wait. Far across the darkness of the valley, low down 12 lines of fire, widely separated, crept toward one another. They appeared thin and slow, with only an occasional leaping flame. And some of the black spaces must have been monuments, blotting out the creeping snail lines of red. Slone watched, strangely fascinated. "What do you think of that?" he said aloud, and he meant his query for Wildfire. As he watched, the lines perceptibly lengthened and brightened, and pale shadows of smoke began to appear. Over at the left of the valley, the 2 brightest fires, the first he had started, crept closer and closer together. They seemed long and covering distance, but not a breath of wind stirred, and besides, they really might move swiftly, without looking so to Slone. When the 2 lines met, a sudden and larger blaze rose. "Ah!" said the rider, and then he watched the other lines creeping together. How slowly the fire moved, he thought. The red stallion would have every chance to run between those lines if he dared. But a wild horse feared nothing like fire. This one would not run the gauntlet of flames. Nevertheless, Slone felt more and more relieved as the lines closed. The hours of the night dragged past until at length one long continuous line of fire spread level across the valley, its bright red line broken only where the monuments of stone were silhouetted against it. The darkness of the valley changed, the light of the moon changed, the radiance of the stars changed. Either the line of fire was finding denser fuel to consume, or it was growing appreciably closer, for the flames began to grow, to leap, to flare. Slone strained his ears for the thud of hooves on sand. The time seemed endless in its futility of results, but fleeting after it had passed, and he could tell how the hours fled by the ever-recurring need to replenish the little fire he kept burning in the pass. A broad belt of valley grew bright in the light, and behind it loomed the monuments, weird and dark, with columns of yellow and white smoke wreathing them. Suddenly Sloane's sensitive ear vibrated to a thrilling sound. He leaned down to place his ear to the sand. Rapid, rhythmic beats of hooves made him leap to his feet, reaching for his lasso with right hand and a gun with his left. Nagger lifted his head, sniffed the air, and snorted. Slone peered back into the black belt of gloom that lay below him. It would be hard to see a horse there unless he got high enough to be silhouetted against the line of fire now flaring to the sky. But he heard the beat of hooves, swift, sharp, louder, louder. The night shadows were deceptive. That wonderful light confused him, made the place unreal. Was he dreaming, or had the long chase and his privations unhinged his mind? He reached for Nagur. No! The big black was alive, real, quivering, pounding the sand. He scented an enemy. Once more Slone peered down into the void, or what seemed a void, but it too had changed, lightened. The whole valley was brightening. Great palls of curling smoke rose white and yellow, to turn back as the monuments met their crests, then to roll upward, blotting out the stars. It was such a light as he had never seen except in dreams. Pale moonlight and dim starlight and wan dawn, all vague and strange and shadowy, under the wild and vivid light of burning grass. In the pale path before Slone, that fan-like slope of sand which opened down into the valley, appeared a swiftly moving black object like a fleeting phantom. It was a phantom horse. Slone felt that his eyes, deceived by his mind, saw racing images. Many a wild chase he had lived in dreams on some far desert. But what was that beating in his ears? Sharp, swift, even rhythmic. Never had his ears played him false. Never had he heard things in his dreams. That running object was a horse, and he was coming like the wind. Slone felt something grip his heart. All the time and endurance and pain and thirst and suspense and longing and hopelessness, the agony of the whole endless chase, closed tight on his heart in that instant. The running horse halted just in the belt of the light cast by the burning grass. There he stood sharply defined, clear as a cameo, not 100 paces from Slone. It was Wildfire. Slone uttered an involuntary cry. Thrill on thrill shot through him. Delight and hope and fear and despair claimed him in swift successive flashes. And then again the ruling passion of a rider held him, the sheer glory of a grand and unattainable horse. For Slone gave up Wildfire in that splendid moment. How had he ever dared to believe he could capture that wild stallion? Slone looked and looked, filling his mind, regretting nothing, sure that the moment was reward for all he had endured. The weird lights magnified Wildfire and showed him clearly. He seemed gigantic. He shone black against the fire. His head was high, his mane flying. Behind him the fire flared, and the valley-wide column of smoke rolled majestically upward, and the great monument seemed to retreat darkly and mysteriously as the flames advanced beyond them. It was a beautiful, unearthly spectacle, with its silence the strangest feature. But suddenly Wildfire broke that silence with a whistle to which Sloane's overstrained faculties seemed a blast as piercing as the splitting sound of lightning, and with the whistle Wildfire plunged up toward the pass. Slone yelled at the top of his lungs, and fired his gun before he could terrorize the stallion and drive him back down the slope. Soon Wildfire became again a running black object, and then he disappeared. The great line of fire had gotten beyond the monuments, and now stretched unbroken across the valley from wall to slope. Wildfire could never pierce that line of flames, and now Slone saw in the paling sky to the east that dawn was at hand.